Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of sectionalism and the gradual approach of the Civil War in the 1850s, in this lecture we move more steadily forward towards the advent of the Civil War itself. In the late 1850s, we will talk about a number of episodes that deepened the divide between North and South in this lesson, which we'll call Deepening Controversy. The presidential election of 1856 was a three-way contest which pitted the Democrat James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, who held some racist tendencies and supported many Southern views such as state rights, against the Republican nominee, the explorer John C. Fremont. But complicating the election was a third-party candidate from the Know Nothing Party, which was declining in influence but still a presence, former President Millard Fillmore. Fillmore may have swayed the election and its final outcome, which went to James Buchanan, because Buchanan easily carried the South, but Fremont could not pull enough support from the North to win the overall election. Buchanan still had some support in the North, and Fillmore drew quite a bit of support there as well. So James Buchanan wins the election in 1856. His presidency was quickly derailed by two events in 1857, one of which was the Panic of 1857, an economic depression that damaged the national economy along with Buchanan's reputation. Northerners were convinced that issues over expansion were hampering the economy, and they blamed Southerners for the debacle. The South, which fared better than the North during this depression, grew even more convinced that a slave-based plantation economy was sound and became even more determined to fight for it. The other issue in 1857 was one of the more significant Supreme Court rulings in all of its history, the Dred Scott decision in the spring of 1857. The court case was Dred Scott versus Sanford. Scott was a Missouri slave who had been brought to the North by his master, who then died. Scott sued for his freedom, and the lower courts agreed with him. But the United States Supreme Court, in a shocking and divisive decision, ruled against Scott for several reasons. First of all, they ruled that Scott, as a slave, was property, and thus couldn't sue in a court of law. There was really no reason for there to even be this court case. Being moved from state to state didn't change his status as a slave and as property. Second, the court determined that the federal government could not determine property rights in the states, and therefore the Missouri Compromise, which had long stood as a source of compromise in the country, had never been constitutional, according to this ruling. The case sent shockwaves around the country. While individual states could still ban slavery, many Northerners now envisioned a nation of slavery spreading throughout the undetermined territories. And Southerners were emboldened by the decision and hoped that slavery would once again be allowed to spread throughout the nation. Even as the series of events that I've been discussing in the previous lectures seemed to move the nation further and further apart, broader economic factors also were driving more and more of a wedge between North and South. And so while on the one hand, Northern and Southern economies were increasingly intertwined, as the Northern industrial economy relied more and more on a steady supply of Southern cotton and other raw materials. In almost every other imaginable way, the economies of North and South were growing further and further apart. I've mentioned in previous lectures the evolution of industry, which was becoming increasingly a Northern phenomenon as the South relied more and more on agriculture and slavery. And so we see more and more factories in the North developing interchangeable parts and the facilities to create their products more and more efficiently and rapidly. Similarly, the introduction of steam power made factories much more quick and efficient in many of their production capacities. And finally, I've described in other lectures the influx of immigrants, primarily Irish and German, but many others as well, which allowed the continued growth of the northern economy, which was soaring throughout the 1850s. The Crystal Palace exhibition in New York City in 1853, which was attended by more than 1 million visitors, provided in stark display the differences between the northern economy and the southern. Viewers got to witness many new inventions like McCormick's mechanical reaper, the rotary printing press, and the elevator, while the only significant southern contribution were new and updated versions of the cotton gin. Northern states were also increasingly unified by a growing network of railroad track. Track had numbered about 9,000 miles in 1850, and by 1860 numbered more than 30,000 miles. Many of those tracks connected northern states and cities with those in the Midwest, such as Chicago, Illinois, which was rising. And fewer of them connected the North directly to the South, and trade along rivers and canals had not grown as much as trade along the railroads during this era. While some industry made its way into the Upper South in places like Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, most of the South continued to rely, and in fact relied even more, on the traditional staple crops of tobacco, sugar, and rice, and of course most noteworthy, cotton, which in this era was described with the famous phrase, "Cotton is king." Proponents of industry in the South during this era made little headway, and the North far outpaced the South in industrial production and railroad track. And so the South remained an agricultural society, and so it would seem would remain as long as that was the most profitable way for it to conduct business. The growing divide between North and South became one of the primary features in the congressional elections around the country in 1858. Nowhere was this more prominent than in the debate for the Senate seat from Illinois, pitting Senator Stephen A. Douglas against a relatively unknown young Republican challenger named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas to a series of debates, and Douglas, one of the foremost politicians of his age, anticipated little trouble from the upstart lawyer in Lincoln. The so-called Lincoln-Douglas debates, and there were 7 of them, became one of the best-known expressions of the national debate over slavery in this era. It was over the course of these debates that a clear line was drawn between the Republican Party of Lincoln and the Democrats of Douglas. The Republican Party opposed, as Lincoln said, "I contemplate slavery as a moral, social, and political evil." Douglas waffled on the issue. He didn't seem to care much if a particular legislature passed slavery up or down. To him, slavery was a legal and political issue, not a moral one. He often made racial slurs, and the equality of blacks was never an issue to Douglas. Among the famous statements made by Lincoln over the course of these debates were, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Lincoln also argued that the black man was entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. "He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man." And finally, Lincoln said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Because Lincoln is such a better-known figure to us today than Douglas, we might forget that Douglas actually won the Senate seat in that election in 1858. But it's really the debates that we remember more than the outcome of the election. And over the course of those debates, Lincoln had compelled Douglas to make statements that would come back to haunt him in more broad elections later. And most important of all, these debates raised Lincoln to the national stage and made him a figure that would have to be reckoned with in the future, and of course would go on to win the presidential election in 1860.